Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Fascinating that I think anybody who knows you're a public transit consultant and you write so much about transit, they would imagine you living just in the sort of densest, quarriest area where 10 train lines converge, but you live in an idyllic neighborhood that's very classically it's almost I wouldn't say pastoral, but it's just a super pleasant neighborhood on the edge of eastern edge, I would say, of Portland. What brought you here to this type of place?
Well, I came back to Portland for family reasons after having lived in many other places. I grew up in Portland, first moved here in 1969, so I was present for the 1970s, which is when Portland really, when a couple of really extraordinary leaders in Portland and in Oregon really turned the battleship and pointed Portland on its current sustainable direction. So I've always associated Portland with a really inspiring story of something that was happening when I was a teenager in the 1970s. In terms of why I came back here and why I came back to this particular place, mostly I made a decision that another part of what Portland is about is having some attachment to land, doing a bit of your own gardening, growing a bit of your own vegetables, which I do here, and that's very important to me. And so I made the decision to come back to a slightly larger parcel than average in Portland just so that I could do that. But I'm glad you say this is an idyllic neighborhood. I like it. We're certainly not on the east edge of Portland. We're on the east edge of sort of the innermost, coolest part of Portland, the part of Portland that you would construct Portlandia out of, and the part of Portland that you would probably take a lot of photographs of. But this is But I like this neighborhood because we have, in particular, these very narrow but very deep lots where the narrowness of the lot frontage creates a feeling of reasonable density on the street, but where we have a little bit of private space to play in the back.
And what do you call this neighborhood? What is this area called? Because we are many blocks away from the true eastern edge. That's right. I should know better at this point. But where exactly are we?
97206. There are a number of different neighborhood names that wander around in this general area. Somewhere in the city, there's an authority that knows exactly where the boundaries of every neighborhood is, and all that's been negotiated. I don't attach myself to any particular neighborhood name. We're just off 52nd Avenue in Southeast Portland. We're in I think there are several different neighborhood names wandering around, but I'm sure 52nd right here is a boundary, so it doesn't matter that much.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from somewhere in southeast Portland. Speaking today with Jarrett Walker, public transit consultant for over 20 years, a blogger on public transit at humantransit.org, and the author of the book Human Transit, How Clear Thinking About Public Transit Can Enrich Our Communities and Our Lives. Now, people think of Portland as a very transity city and a very bikeable city, a city in the context of the United States of America where getting around is easy, no matter what you're doing. It does seem that way to me. It seems legitimately true, but it's also, the reputation is so strong, isn't it? I mean, this is the city people think of if they think of ease of mobility, right?
A lot of praise deserves to be lavished on a lot of people for Portland being as, I would say, as fundamentally oriented towards sustainable transport as it is. I would say that when you're in the inner parts of Portland, and I would say we're just about at the outer edge of the inner part here, that it really is very easy to get around by a complete suite of alternative modes, not just transit and cycling, but also car sharing when you need it. Car sharing is very big here, and we have some great car sharing innovations happening now, like the new Car2Go product, which allows you to pick up and drop at different locations. So yes, it's easy not to own a car here if you live in the inner part of the city. Having said that, I do think that Portland has an extraordinary capacity for self-marketing. And like everyone, as with friends and lovers, it's always a little bit nicer if they don't know how beautiful they are and they don't know how wonderful they are. And I have to say, I liked Portland a little better before it was so absolutely clear on how absolutely wonderful it is.
When did that happen? When did it start knowing?
I think that happened in the 90s. Is my sense. That's
dream
when
of the 90s is alive in Portland.
That's
I hear.
when the real. That's when all the speakers from Portland just started pouring out across the world, giving the same basic PowerPoint with the same basic pictures that make Portland look like paradise. And, it is a wonderful city. It's an extremely intimate city. The intimacy comes from actually a 19th century decision, which is that the blocks are very short. But certainly in downtown Portland in particular, there is just a striking sense of human scale about the place that very few downtowns anywhere in the world really achieve, except maybe in Europe. So, there are some wonderful things about that. Absolutely spectacular, amazing things were done here in the 70s, which is when the battleship was actually turned. That was when...
where was the battleship going already?
The battleship was going in the direction of most American cities at that time, which was toward more and more freeways, more and more sprawl, more and more car dependence. And what happened in the 1970s was two things. We got a governor by the name of Tom McCall, who was, I should add, a Republican. Republicans were, at the time, the Oregon state politics were completely dominated by moderate Republicans who would be totally unwelcome in the Republican Party today. But Governor McCall put together an extraordinary coalition to create the state land use laws, which require strong urban growth boundaries around Oregon cities. At the time, it was really an agricultural preservation measure. It was a response to the fact that Oregon's best farmland was directly adjacent to its cities and was being chewed up very rapidly by horizontal urban growth. And there was a strong, and Governor McCall put together a coalition of both agricultural interests who at that time were focused primarily on saving agriculture rather than on the ability to sell their land for development, and on urban interests who were already becoming alarmed by the fact that the countryside, which everyone values, was getting further and further away every year as the city sprawled outward. And so the Oregon State land use planning system, which was created at that time, mandates these very strong urban growth boundaries, mandates quite an intentionally complicated and difficult and laborious process to expand those boundaries. And as a result, there is an outward limit that pushes inward and encourages infill by essentially dramatically raising the price of sprawl. We are very clear in this state that the cities are not surrounded by empty space. You go to a place like Phoenix, and it's very clear that they view themselves as being surrounded by just blank space into which they can expand without any consequence. And obviously, that's an easier fantasy to maintain in the desert, although it's not even true there. But here, we're very clear that there is no blank space. That every space already has a use. That use already has value. That both aesthetic and economic, and so there's a real concern about that. And even though there's been quite a bit of modification to the land use laws over the years and a fair number of property rights type acts of rebellion against them, those laws still define, I think, a pretty core part of Oregon's values and a core consensus that still exists. Then the other thing that happened in the 1970s was that we got an extraordinary mayor in Portland by the name of Neil Goldschmidt. And during his almost 8 years in office, it's just extraordinary what all was done. We had the Tom McCall, what is now the Tom McCall Waterfront Park, was formerly a waterfront freeway, which was ripped out in that period and replaced with a park. A freeway called the Mount Hood Freeway, which was to go right out through southeast Portland and bulldoze about a 6-block wide swath of what are now really beautiful and expensive inner city neighborhoods, was canceled under his leadership, and the money reallocated to get a start on the very first light rail line, which was the Banfield line, which began to be planned during his mayoralty. And then probably the most astonishing thing of all, when you imagine how hard this is to do, 5th and 6th Avenues through downtown being closed to cars, and turned over entirely to transit the very central streets through downtown, and to create the transit mall that we know today, which existed as a predominantly bus-only mall from 1978 to 2008, so for 30 years, and then in 2008 was remodeled to add light rail, but is still quite an extraordinary achievement and replicated in very few other places. So it's clear, one of the frustrating things, frankly, about being a political leader in Portland is that it always feels on some level like everything you could possibly do is footnotes to this incredible moment in history, which really is when the fundamental values of the city actually turned. And ever since then, we have been moving, definitely, continuing to improve things, moving in this direction that was largely set at that time. A lot of great things have happened more recently. The bicycle revolution, I think, was not at all envisioned in the Goldschmidt era. It has happened more recently. The Portland streetcar, which became, for better or worse, the sort of model for the American streetcar revival movement. I have major issues with it, but that happened in the 1990s. So there continues to be change and innovation in the same direction. But for those of us who were here in the 1970s, there's always that sense that yes, that was the moment when you could actually feel the entire city changing its mind and going a new direction.
Fascinating that it happened in the 70s, because I think of the 70s, correct me if I'm wrong, but in America it's the sort of nadir of the car era. It's like, San Francisco's BART system was built then, and it really bears the mark of being a 70s system where it's like, well, you drive to this thing and then you take it to one of the 6 stops in town maybe. But Portland, that must have been even more against the grain than one would think hearing it today. I mean, I wasn't even around then, but it seems to me like the 70s, that's the least likely time.
Exactly. That's what's so remarkable about Portland. And when you look at what Portland's achieved, and lots of people, of course, vast numbers of people running around with PowerPoints are ready to take credit for it. But you have to understand that there is history to it. You always have to remember, too, the intimacy of downtown is so much about the fact that we have 200-foot blocks, which is a 19th century decision. But then this extraordinary period in the 1970s, that really was the revolution. That was the revolution. And ever since then, we've been managing a revolutionary government. But that was the revolution. Right. That was the time that was the moment when the vision of urban development as being entirely oriented toward automobiles was defeated decisively, at least in Portland itself. But there are still battles around the suburbs. We have some suburban areas that are fairly conservative and still very car oriented. But by and large, that battle is over.
You write about being a kid in Portland and before the Max, before the revived streetcars, and watching the buses pass by and seeing the headers up there on top, saying where they were going, and sort of envisioning how they were getting where they were going, and getting interested in transit. I guess at that moment, I mean, what did it feel like to watch those and to think about and get fascinated by where the buses were going?
If you've ever been in an airport and had a spare moment and to just stare at the departure board and to just think, wow, people are departing to all these places right now. It's the same feeling. It's the same feeling. One of the things I loved about the Transit Mall was this sense that you had this menu that was just pouring past you all the time of service departing to all these different parts of the city. And one of the things I also admire about TriMet is that it's unlike many agencies. The electric signage on his buses is extremely clear. It says very simple things like Division Street to 122nd Avenue, which describes the route very clearly to anybody who happens to see the bus. So it's a very legible and as much as possible kind of transparent system. And I've always believed that that's a very important feature of transit, and I'm always trying to help transit agencies disambiguate themselves and figure out how to present what they do in very transparent and natural ways. I think that was part of the excitement. I also was simply a geography geek. It's a kind of almost quasi-autistic kind of ability to
I know the feeling
to memorize geography. to memorize geography kind of instantaneously and compulsively, and you naturally come to take an interest in geographical systems. You naturally come to take an interest in systems that operate in geographical space, and a fascination with how they work, and the desire to sort of visualize the remarkable patterns by which things move, by which vehicles and people are moving around the system. So that it's that. I mean, you ask what it does for a geeky teenager. It does that. It's that sort of obsession. It was, substantially, and although I think I was already growing up certainly as an environmentalist. I mean, my parents very strongly had those values. I don't think I was. I think the passion and the sense of public transit as an urgent and necessary mission is probably something that came a little later in my 30s, probably, when I came back to the field.
Now, I mentioned your professional blog, Human Transit, and anybody can read that and get much information on transit and your thoughts on it. There's also your personal blog, A Creature of the Shade, I believe it's called. You talk about exploring cities a lot in that blog, and I wonder what would you say to someone who is enthusiastic about cities, interested in cities, but they've not thought about them in a public transit framework? What does public transit give you in terms of how you think about cities? What makes cities more interesting to think about even than they were before when you think about their transit?
I think this is a challenge not just about transit, but about thinking about transportation generally. What I tend to find is, there is an extraordinary and extremely harmful separation of professions between people who perceive themselves to be doing urban design and placemaking, and people who perceive and development, and people who perceive themselves to be doing transport planning or infrastructure plan or infrastructural systems generally. And the problem goes down to something as simple as the fact that we have to think in different dimensions. That the developer, the placemaker, who tends to be much, much more politically connected and presumed to be prestigious and elite compared to the transport expert and certainly the public transit specialist, thinks on the scale of the place or the site. They have a box around some sort of place that they're creating. And transport planners think in lines. They have to think in corridors. They have to think in linear patterns of movement, which cut across multiple places and also multiple neighborhoods, multiple constituencies, multiple points of view. So what's most challenging, and now frankly, the highway engineers have been able to do this because they had a manual.
Right.
And in the high era of highway engineering in the 60s and 70s, when the interstate system was being fully built out, and when every sensible person just assumed that continuous highway construction was the future, this manual had so much power, and the profession itself had so much esteem, that the manual basically just bulldozed through cities, right? It's
literally
it's almost like you take this book and you just scrape it along the ground, and whatever was there gets out of the way.
Right.
That's really how it was. Well, the massive public revolt against the consequences of that has created all these environmental laws which quite justifiably no longer allow that to occur. But of course, it means we'll never be able to build transit with quite the same sense of ease.
Right.
And we now have to build transit by very different rules from those by which highways were built.
Right.
Look what happened with the highways. We can't let you transit guys build like that.
Exactly.
And maybe they're right in some sense.
And so part of what's happened is that there's this tremendous revolt against the culture of highway engineering. And an organization called the Congress for the New Urbanism, for example, which is an organization primarily driven by architects and placemakers who view transport engineering as, or who view certainly classic highway engineering as the enemy, and many of whom are just suspicious about transport in general. And so there's this fascinating conflict between the sort of extreme idealistic architect and urban designer who is drawing this beautiful place and does these magnificent renderings with these little pastel people who are doing exactly what the architect wants them to do, of course. And the challenge that, no, these little pastel people in this drawing are actually going to be citizens of a free society. And if we're in an interesting city, especially, they're going to be doing things that nobody expects. They're going to be creative. They're going to be forming new ways of being and new ways of living. But most importantly, they're going to be free. And what's interesting is that freedom in the context of the city, which I think is such a fundamental idea and is not an idea that can be left to conservatives to care about, individual freedom in the city, I think the ultimate test of that is the transportation system. Are you able to access the entire city? Are you able? I mean, why live in a city if you can't access all of its riches? And that doesn't mean just being able to go down for a really nice symphony orchestra. Yes. It may mean that you want to live in a big city because the big city is large enough to have, I don't know, a Ukrainian nudist pinnacle club or something, and you want to play pinochle in the nude in Ukrainian. Right. And there are 5 people who do that. And you go across the city to see them because you like doing that, right? Whatever it is, the city allows you to specialize. And the city allows you to explore a particular space of creativity that comes from being able to select in those extremely bizarre and personal ways. And that's only possible with a transport system that really does give you access to the entire city. And that requires thinking in corridors. So it's fascinating, we have this movement now going on about streets that is to some extent about insisting, and the CNU is a big part of this, is about insisting that the street is no longer just a transport facility, it's a place where people exist and do things, which is fine. But we have now this all of these movements, and especially in a lot of the very, very environment-conscious West Coast cities where these ideas are really prominent now, all these movements to close streets and turn streets into public spaces and all that, which is great up to a point, but we still need to get places. And I'm always fascinated when I'm interacting with people in the urban design world, how much resistance there is to that. How much resistance there is to the idea that, no, the city does still have to be a free and enabling environment. People do need to be able to get anywhere in the city. They need, and if transit is going to function, then they need to be able to get anywhere in the city in a way where transit is time competitive and attractive and reasonable. And that's why I think that then brings us to the whole question of why we're now investing so much in extremely slow kinds of transit.
The streetcar.
Like the streetcars. The American streetcar revival movement is just the most obvious example of that. And what that's actually achieving, if the task is really to give people access to their entire city.
Now, you consult in so many places. You go to so many cities around the world, and you're describing here, this is the American streetcar revival. This is the American bad history with highway builders, and possibly I'll say North American, the North American conflict between planners, builders, transit specialists. It seems to be especially pronounced here. And I think somebody who lives in North America, who maybe hasn't traveled around a lot and maybe doesn't use transit a lot, might have this rough analysis. They'll say, well, and here in North America, our transit isn't very good, except for in the Portlands of the world. So I got to drive. But in Europe, transit's pretty great. In Asia, it's awesome. And then you have the third world where, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's disaster. What can you add to that analysis? I mean, is that on target at all? Or is it, there's obviously so much more to say, but that picture Americans seem to have about transit in the world, how do you react to that?
When somebody ever asks me what my favorite transit system is, the first thing I have to say, well, it's like asking a poet what his favorite vowel is. That's not the point. Right. Transit systems are so interdependent with their cities and can only be judged in the context of the reality of the city they're serving. And ultimately, what you want out of transit ought to be pretty tightly connected to what you want a city to be. You said something very interesting in the question. You said that many North Americans will perceive that, over most of North America, transit can't be that good, but that it's better in Europe, and that it's way fantastic in East Asia, and I assume you're referring to the wealthy cities of East Asia, to Tokyo and Hong Kong and Singapore and places like that. Well, what have you just described there? You've just described a gradient of density. Yes, if you want the density of Hong Kong, 40-story towers everywhere, you can have and you will need absolutely intensive, high-capacity transit everywhere. As density declines down to the level of, say, the European city, it may be, you probably don't have the sort of massive volumes, but certainly a typical historic European city that's built to 4 or 5 stories is plenty dense enough to support a fantastic, rather locally oriented transit system. And that's, for example, what the Paris Metro is. The Paris Metro is remarkable for its actually rather short average trip lengths, the extreme frequency of its stations, the fact that it is quite completely latticed over all of Paris proper, and it works extremely well. And now, of course, it's generated the need for more and more longer distance, high capacity services going through. But and then you come to the North American city, and you can have the same conversation in North America. Of course, transit's fantastic in New York, in Manhattan, because Manhattan wouldn't function without it. It's really, in many ways, largely about urban density. Now, there's a whole lot of confusion about density, and there are 2 chapters in my book that are just about trying to unpack the concept of density and strip off some of the confusions about it. Because density is such an emotive word, because so many people are terrified of it, there's a huge industry of trying to somehow argue that density doesn't matter after all. But in the big scheme of things, it really is fundamental. Density is how many people or activities or how much stuff is around any particular transit stop. And that's the first order approximation of what's going to be the transit market. So I think that when you think about North America, the challenge is going to be over and over that the great transit achievements that are possible in North America are not possible uniformly over an entire metro area. They're possible in the dense parts of the metro area and connecting the dense parts of the metro area to each other. That's where density will drive demand. You talked earlier about the San Francisco Bay Area BART system, which has always had this problem that although it was built with rapid transit technology designed for high-frequency urban service, where it was built was mostly out into low-density suburbs that could never fill all of those trains except for an hour on each rush hour. And now BART is increasingly coming to be focused on enriching the inner city part of its network where density is high enough and to support really high all-day ridership. And that's going to be fundamentally the links between San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley, which are the 3 cities on the network, right at the center of the network, that really are capable of generating high demand. So now BART's talking, for example, about infill stations that enable on the existing lines that enable them to provide to cover those areas more completely and to provide a more urban metro kind of experience. So that same kind of transition is happening. Again, it comes down to the problem of density. BART was ultimately a very strange technology choice, a very high cost technology choice to go out into places that were never going to be very dense and that were never going to fill a train except for a few minutes at the rush hour.
I don't know if you've read Peter Hall's book, Great Planning Disasters, but I presume you have. And there's a thorough examination of BART there, which is surprising how disastrous it was to begin with. You wouldn't know it to write it today because it seems nice.
Look, oh yes, it seems nice, and it's all the nicer because once you're out of the big cities, you have the car almost to yourself on the midday. People love. Fantastically inefficient transit systems are often the most pleasant to ride, because they're not crowded, and you get to enjoy everything. But great transit is crowded. Successful transit is crowded,
right.
And BART is crowded only where it's successful. Where BART is crowded all day, only where it is successful all day, and that's in its links between the innermost, densest parts of the region.
Happens to be 16th and Mission, 24th and Mission, all those. Now you said what you said about density. That. It's why it gets at why I personally live in the densest neighborhood in all of Los Angeles, because density affords you many things. But then I get to a neighborhood like the one you live in here, happily in Portland, and I see less density affords you many good things as well. And this is kind of a theme in your work. It's like, well, there's good things no matter what choice you make, which is why your choice is going to be very hard, right. City operators. But Los Angeles, This seems to have provides right now, it seems like for you, a fascinating city to discuss because it is in this sort of a transitional moment. The idea of building transit was much delayed, but now seems to be in full flower. And certainly I find myself anticipating each new opening of a rail line or each improvement of a bus line, for example. But tell me, what's, from a professional transit consultant's perspective, what is interesting about Los Angeles? Most of the interviews on the show are in Los Angeles, after all, so it's a city that's been much discussed here. What's your perspective on what's fascinating?
I have so many more perspectives than a transit planner. I also have a literary perspective.
Yes. Give me all of them.
I have the perspective of having read Mike Davis and Rainer Banham and a lot of the other people who've opined about Los Angeles over the years. I also have the experience of having done my undergraduate degree in Claremont, which is 35 miles east of Los Angeles, and which at the time I was there in the early 80s, had no train, had really no one had any concept of why anyone wouldn't want to drive anywhere. But I lived there without a car and felt quite stranded, and made very little use of Los Angeles because it was so hard to get there. The public transit at that time was appalling. It was third world out there. But I love Los Angeles. I love Los Angeles as somebody who has really hated Los Angeles. I know that when I finished my undergrad degree, I remember flying out of that thick orange soup that surrounds Ontario Airport and feeling like I hoped never to come back. In fact, I've come back over and over throughout my life to work with a number of different transit agencies there on a number of different other things there. And I think that, I mean, first of all, before we even get to the sort of promise of Los Angeles, Los Angeles is a city that just captures the imagination in some kind of bizarre way. And it's not just because it's on television all the time.
Right.
It's because Los Angeles is a city on the edge. It is a city that defines itself by being on the edge. It defines itself by being a little bit disorganized and chaotic and vulnerable. There was a marvelous book years ago by Mike Davis called The Ecology of Fear. The subtitle is Los Angeles and the Imagination of Disaster. And it was simply making the, I think, fairly obvious case that Los Angeles is in love with disaster, that the extraordinary vulnerabilities of Los Angeles have been so completely incorporated into the city's image of itself and incorporated into both the global perception of it as a fascinating city and the kind of decision that is involved for each individual in choosing to live there. You know, I've thought many times about living in Los Angeles again, now that it's so much more livable than it was. And, you know, it's an interesting decision, you know, to go back to embracing the possibilities of the earthquakes and the tsunamis and the fires and all of the other kinds of bizarre, challenging reality that are part of the fact that Los Angeles is what it is where it is, and was built in defiance of its environment in so many ways. But, you know, Los Angeles is one of those places that's just too big and too overwhelming and just too amazing to really make very strong judgments about.
500 square miles. What are you going to do?
It is. And its existence and its vibrancy and its incredible creativity is just bigger than anyone's petty judgments about anything, you know?
Right.
And yes, all kinds of crimes were involved in creating it, you know, all the way back to the destruction of Mono Lake. But fundamentally, what can you say? It is one of the world's great cities. It is one of the it is the developed world's probably best example of a city that is completely decentered, largely centerless, largely about its edges, largely about and where everyone can be in the center.
Right.
So, what does that mean for transit? Los Angeles has probably the best geography in America to be an incredibly transit-oriented city. And the reason for that is what it has in common with Paris, actually, which is that it has a rather continuous, large, central area that is relatively dense. And I mean large. I mean the whole area from downtown to Westwood. the whole area extending then from the Santa Monica Mountains down to around I-10 or a little south, and also then areas spilling over into the other valleys, Glendale, Sherman Oaks, the eastern San Fernando Valley, which is now increasingly almost 2 or 3 stories. So much density there, and yet also huge, huge centers which tend to be on the edges of that density rather than in the middle of it. That's the perfect geography for transit, because what that means, you visualize, and the Wilshire subway is probably, most transport planners will tell you, is probably going to be one of the most perfect subway lines in the world.
Right. That's why I live 1 block from it.
Because it's going to have a great mass of towers at each end. Westwood, UCLA, and Century City at the west end, downtown at the east end. And the middle of it is continuously dense. But the thing that's wonderful about it is that the train will never be empty, because it ends at these massive destinations in both sides. And it has completely bidirectional demand all day. People have this fantasy that something like the single-centered city like Chicago is the ideal transit city. And no, it's not. Because a single-centered city like Chicago means you have to run huge amounts of trains into the city in the morning that all come out empty. You have to run huge amounts of trains empty in the afternoon that all come out full. The demand is so overwhelming one directional. Whereas what's great in technical terms about Los Angeles, what I also think is what makes it a fascinating city, is that it's going to be a constellation of major centers, that you're going to go out and look across the city and see these multiple clumps of towers everywhere, and transit will be the link between them. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but have you ever driven down the 138 freeway through Glendale, the east-west freeway through Glendale, and noticed that sense that Glendale is a north-south wall of towers, very thin and long. And have you ever thought this is like being on a spaceship going through the rings of Saturn?
I don't have a car, but now I want to rent one and do that. I want the experience.
I realized long ago that there's something that connects with science fiction about LA's freeways, and that's this sense that you go along through this space, and now and then you go past a planet. You go past a big mass of something, and it's there, and you whisk past it, and maybe you stop or you go into orbit. But that the relationship of the role of these many high-rise centers is such an important part of how Los Angeles feels, how Los Angeles functions, the fact that there is that much density. And it also makes it obvious, I think, to everyone that once you have a place as dense as downtown Glendale and a place as dense as West Hollywood or downtown LA or wherever else, you have a huge market for people who want to get from one of those to the other and who would just as soon be a pedestrian in both places, right? Because it's easy to be a pedestrian in both places. So there's this marvelous opportunity for transit which is not about pulling people out of the suburbs so much as it is, here's a colossal mass of pedestrians called Westwood. Here's a colossal mass of pedestrians called downtown. Here are all these other pedestrian places in between them. Let's take pedestrians beyond their walking distance and deliver them into pedestrian spaces as pedestrians. And that's the special thing that transit does. And I think Los Angeles, especially with its largely nice weather and the remarkable structure of really having a lot of wonderful pedestrian spaces, but just needing to get pedestrians over the gaps between them, is almost a perfect kind of opportunity for transit to be the foundation of the city.
Now, when you land in a city and you ride its transit for the first time, be the city Los Angeles, Hong Kong, or Portland, wherever, Sydney, where you consulted for quite a while, what are you aware of, whether you're there to work or not? What do you keep your senses heightened about when you're using a city's transit system?
Do they want me to understand it as a system? Do they want to present me with a single transit system that shows how everything works together and whose purpose is to present me with images of my freedom to move around the city? Portland does that fairly well. Portland has a unitary transit system. Everything is more or less designed to work together, although the political understanding of that is fraying a little bit locally. Vancouver does this very well. You come out of the airport and get onto Vancouver's Canada line, which is the rapid transit line into the city. And you're quickly being presented with maps of the entire network showing how everything fits together, and increasingly good mapping and wayfinding that's trying to help you feel empowered. Australia does this miserably. Australia presents the customer with maps of whatever service you're currently on or whatever other service that operator operates. But it's very clear that there is generally in Australia, a poor grasp at the level of shared communications of the idea that everything should work together at one system. Now, I want to give some areas credit for progress on this. Sydney has just recently created a unitary public transport authority that is for the first time going to sit over all the operating agencies and require them to coordinate. So I think you'll see that improve in the future. But again, the cities, the countries that went through the sort of Thatcherite privatization fantasy tend to have a lot more difficulty presenting information to the customer in a way that emphasizes their own freedom. That's one of the first things I react to. Then, of course, I react to look and feel, just as everyone does. I react to the quality of vehicles, but I think I react first and foremost to how much does this agency want to treat me as a free actor and want to help me feel free.
Right. There's a word you particularly dislike that gets thrown around a lot in transit: captive rider, right? And you never want to be treated that way, right?
Right. And there's this old-fashioned, lazy binary attitude that says that transit riders can be divided into choice riders and captive riders. And for the choice rider, you're expected to envision the person who has a car and chooses to leave it at home. And for the captive rider, you're supposed to envision the poor, helpless person who has to use transit because they can't afford a car. And that is just so not true anymore. Right. So many people are making the choice, as one commenter said on my blog, I choose not to own a car. Does that make me a choice rider or a captive one?
Yeah, I'm in the exact same boat myself. Yes. What am I?
Well, and there are transport engineers who, once you sell your car, will decide that you're a captive and will assume, therefore, here's what's wrong. They will assume that you're largely insensitive to differentials in quality.
I see.
When in fact you are sensitive. At some point, if the transit got too bad, you would buy a car. You would move away, or you would, Right. So, this choice captive opposition is hearkening back to a very old binary attitude that is just not how the world works anymore. That's why I tend to come down very hard on it whenever I hear those terms.
I want to know, what it takes to surprise you in a transit system. I hear people who are transit enthusiasts who go to maybe Santiago or Prague and are somehow surprised by what those systems offer. Well, what does it take to surprise a Jarrett Walker about transit?
What an interesting question. I am so used to transit being confusing, sad, unpleasant, that I prefer to be surprised by delight. Having said that, I think that, and so I've had lots of just delightful experiences where, I've come into a city and found transit working really well, welcoming me. They've paid good attention to the airport station, for example, and they've thought about how they welcome people and how those stations in particular affect the welcoming experience.
The airport station is what a lot of this comes down to sometimes, right? If one exists, I'm happy.
Well, for people really though, you have to put that in context. We're talking now about the experience of the visitor, and the visitor is a very, very tiny part of the local transit market. You shouldn't be designing your transit system around that. In fact, there's a whole ongoing issue in transit with airport service because it's politically far more popular than its actual ridership would suggest. And that's because so many people, everybody practically in the city, loves the idea of having transit to the airport, but most of them have no intention of using it or are only going to use it once or twice a year. So airport transit actually, unfortunately, also falls into this category of what I would call symbolic transit. Right. But if you have a huge airport, or if you're a big city with a huge airport, it certainly makes sense to try after all, everyone going to the airport is going to one building. You might as well take advantage of that concentration if you can. So yes, but airport stations are important arrival experiences. I prefer to be surprised by delight. I've had lots of horrible airport station experiences, like flying into Chicago on Memorial Day and discovering that you would think that on Memorial Day weekend a city would transit agency with like, hey, we got a big holiday. Lots of people are flying in. Let's go make sure the ticket machines work in the airport station. No. But by and large, I prefer to tell positive stories about arrival experiences that have been just a tremendous delight. I would say that a lot of the Asian cities. I have not been to Hong Kong yet. I'm going for the first time in a couple of days, but everyone has told me that I will be amazed by the airport experience, the airport transit experience in Hong Kong. I have had the airport transit experience in Singapore, which is just ravishingly ravishing. Just because everything is so beautiful and so efficient. But, I've also, it's not just a matter of, there being a train and it being shiny. I also have tremendous admiration for airports like Schiphol, which is you might as well call it the national airline of the national airport of the Netherlands. It's the Amsterdam airport, but the Netherlands is so small that it's basically the whole country's airport. And that's interesting because there's a rail station in it that is not simply, a cute fast train to downtown, which is what you have in Hong Kong or famously now in Shanghai. But it is a rail station on the whole country's rail network where you can get direct trains to lots of different places. And so you have the sense that the airport is not just out there at the end of a line, but is actually right in the middle. So for example, trains from Amsterdam to Brussels are mostly stopping at this airport on the way. So you arrive in a place that's a node right in the middle of the network where you've got opportunities directly to go to lots of different places. That's very important in the Netherlands, by the way, because the Netherlands is also rather like Los Angeles. Its core urban area actually consists of 6 or 7 cities arranged in a ring. The whole thing is the whole mass of those cities is about the size is smaller than LA County. And so people are moving around among all those cities all the time. And really the whole ring of cities is one urban area.
What kind of questions can you ask? I mean, whether it's asking it of transit operators, whether it's asking it to yourself as you ride a transit system, what kind of questions will really reveal a lot about a city, about how transit works in a city? I mean, what do you find yourself asking?
The basic message of my book is that if you pay close attention to the public transit tool, the geometric way that lines and connections and schedules work, the math of that, you find that it asks you certain rather powerful questions about what you want. And much of my work is simply, and my book argues, and much of my work argues, that to the extent that cities, communities, boards, elected boards have conversations about those particular questions and form a view about those particular questions, it becomes possible for transit to move forward with much less second guessing, much clearer direction, much clearer sense of what everybody's doing. And some of those questions are, do you view transit as being primarily about commuting? Or do you view transit as fundamental urban structure that's for all kinds of purposes of life? Now, that's absolutely fundamental. And the reason I pause on a question like that is frequently when you listen to people to talk and you realize they're talking past each other, it's often because they have different assumptions about that. One is just assuming that, of course, transit is about the commute, and another is just assuming the opposite. And that leads to totally different kinds of transit systems and totally different kinds of transit outcomes. Then there's a question about, is your transit system primarily about, are you being motivated in the development of your transit by the coolness of vehicles? And the way to put that, I think, very objectively is to say, is the technology the goal or is the technology a tool? That's really the question. And the technology as goal approach is, ooh, look at this cool thing. We went to wherever and saw whatever. We went to Sydney and saw the monorail. And so we want a monorail. And actually you can have one because Sydney's tearing its down. And so we bring this thing home, and then where do we put it? It's that sort of process. And if you've ever visited, and there are cities that have very much this quality, Kuala Lumpur comes to mind. It's a place where a bunch of different organizations have built different rail lines, and some of them are elevated and some are underground, but they don't really fit together. They don't really connect properly. It's obviously just a bunch of different visions jumbled together, right? And so there's this question about is technology a tool? And I think the example of Kuala, do we start by thinking about what kind of mobility we want? What kind of freedom do we want to provide to people? What are the quantitative features of that? And then does the technology follow from that? And I guess another way of thinking about the same thing is the very important question is, do we want one transit system? Or do we want a bunch of different products running around that may be competing for different markets or different purposes?
And where in the world are those questions answered most interestingly right now?
Well, I think that different cities are making different choices about those things more or less consciously, but only more or less. I do think, for example, that most of the cities in the sort of Thatcher-influenced world, or in a highly private sector-dominated world, like certainly Kuala Lumpur is, and like, frankly, a lot of fast developing cities are, those are. I don't think they have quite grappled with the fact that by letting everyone sort of build their own project and create this sort of jumble of lines running around that don't really connect, they've lost something very important, which is the idea of a system that really leaves you free to go wherever you want to go. Instead, it's just like having a bunch of products on the shelf. And if one of those products works for you, then great. If not, you're out of luck. But I think that, we do have great examples of highly unified transit systems that really are presenting themselves as being instruments of freedom. I would mention Vancouver's as probably one of the best at the sort of North American urban scale, although obviously it has that city has an amazing story of its own about its flirtation with almost Asian levels of density and having done that fairly recently. And many European cities, obviously. You land in a German city and you'll see a very, very clear map that shows you exactly all the possibilities. Again, that excitement we talked about at the very beginning of look at everywhere I could go right now.
Just look at it.
Just look at it.
I've been speaking here in Southeast Portland, Oregon with Jarrett Walker, public transit consultant, author of the blog Human Transit and the book Human Transit as well, and the blog Creature of the Shade, which I think anybody listening to the show will be interested in seeing as well. Jarrett, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down today.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for coming by, Colin.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall, and you can keep up with all of the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the program at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.